Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating, from the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day. Each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello. Happy Friday and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Oh my God, today, extra cool show. We have Bill Birnes from UFO Hunters and Ancient Aliens on the show, and we're going to be talking about a quest for extraterrestrial life. But don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can learn about all of the services that I offer, as well as the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And please do stop by the Just Energy Radio website. That's www.justenergyradio.com, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep informed of the guests we have coming on the show, as well as check out our over 5 years worth of incredible archives. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest, Bill, and we're going to get him on the air because I think we have a lot to talk about. The host of History Channel's UFO Hunters, New York Times best-selling author William J. Birnes is a magazine and book publisher and a New York literary publishing agent and book and television producer. He has written and edited over 25 books and encyclopedias in the fields of human behavior, true crime, current affairs, history, psychology, business, computing, and the paranormal. He is currently the author of Space Wars and the Counterspace, and Hauntings of America, and Journey to the Light. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio from UFO Magazine and the author of the Everything UFO book, or the new Everything UFO book, Bill Birnes. Hey, Bill, how are you doing?
How you doing? I'm fine. How are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for coming on the show and spending some time. I think, you are so involved in so many different areas of current affairs and human behavior. It's just amazing that one person can be so well versed in everything. Maybe you need a book, the Everything Book of Everything.
Well, that's a good idea. I don't know who'd publish it, but I think that's a good idea.
So let's start easy. How did you first, we're going to be talking about UFOs, although I am a little intrigued, the Haunting of America. I just never saw you as a ghosty kind of guy, and we like talking about spooks on this show. But how did you first become interested in the whole concept of UFOs and extraterrestrials?
Well, it was something that really found me more than I found it, simply because I was working as handling literary rights for a motion picture company in Los Angeles, and in so doing, even though we were not doing anything with UFOs, it was something really more traditional. One of the people that was involved with this company in terms of rights acquisition was someone who had was Philip Corso, who testified before the one of the House subcommittees on POWs, missing POWs and missing in action personnel after the Korean War. And Phil Corso had been one of the negotiators at the end of the war for President Eisenhower on Operation Little Switch, Big Switch. And in the course of, and I was really trying to, since I was going to be the editor of a book on this for that motion picture company and handling the rights to New York publishers and editing the material from two other writers, one of whom was Jim Sanders, who wrote the book on the downing of TWA Flight 800, and the other was a former CIA station chief who'd done research on the subject from the Vietnam War. Phil Corso was testifying before Congress. In the conversations with Corso, he really dropped the Roswell bomb, and his job in Army R&D with the Roswell debris that he said he was tasked by his commanding officer, Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau, to filter into American defense contractor industry. And so immediately the motion picture company asked me to see if there was a book in this, and I called my publisher, Simon & Schuster, that I was working with a number of books at the time, and they said, absolutely, but if and only if you can complete this book within 12 months so that we can publish it and have it ready for sale on the day of the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash, which would have been in 1997, and really release the book in Roswell, New Mexico, in July 1997. I did, they did, and the owners of UFO Magazine at the time covered the book, reviewed the book, did a follow-up interview with me and with Phil Corso, and in the after wash of those interviews, they basically said to me, look, you know, we're having a lot of financial difficulty. Do you think the folks who own this motion picture company might be interested in becoming partners in the magazine or buying the magazine? And the motion picture company did, and after 5 or 6 years, they said, you know what, this magazine business really is too much for us. It's just a lot of overhead, a lot of work, and very little results. So you know what you're doing with the magazine, because they made me kind of publisher emeritus. So you know what you're doing with the magazine, you know, and we entered into a deal, and I acquired the magazine from them. And that's really, and then History Channel approached me 12 months later about being one of their experts on the old UFO Files shows. And I did, and then from there we developed UFO Hunters and Ancient Aliens, and then America's Book of Secrets. So I've been on History Channel for 8 years, and that's how I got into the whole UFO field, but more as a journalist and an investigative journalist.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that we're not here alone?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from looking at the documentary evidence, the video evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and the government documents from over the past 60-plus years, not to mention stuff from ancient history, but I'm just talking about recent history since 1945, from the overflights of the Hanford nuclear plant, Hanford, Washington nuclear plant in 1945. Hanford was where they were processing the nuclear material, enriching the nuclear material for the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. So from 1945 on, I think it's been pretty clear that the government has taken a serious interest. Call it a cover-up, call it anything you want to call it. But the government's been taking a serious interest and acknowledging that we're not alone on this planet. So I tend to go along with the government.
If you had to pick one investigation, I mean, is it the one that you were just talking about, or, I mean, because you've been involved in so many in these last few years, if you had to pick one of them that kind of took you over the line and convinced you that we're not alone, what would that be?
Well, I mean, there are so many, but let's just take, you know, like the mother of all UFO encounters, because it basically combines kind of everything that you look for in a really good UFO investigation. Also, it came so early in UFO history one of the areas that I write in a lot is true crime. And I deal, and my books, Riverman and Signature Killers and the Cho Sung Hui book that I did for Academic Press a couple of years ago, and books like that, all deal with, for the most part, serial killers, episodic crime, and why these episodic offenders are so elusive to catch. The police really have a hard time catching them. And ultimately, where police investigators go, for the most part, historically, traditionally, where police investigators go is they try and find the earliest cases in a series of offenses, be it, sexual offenses or whatever. They try to find the earliest, because the more accomplished an episodic offender gets in committing crimes, the more and more that person is able to cover his tracks. But in the very, very early crimes, the person literally is kind of just breaking in and tends to leave very telling clues. Well, that's the same thing with UFO investigations. Believe it or not, the more accomplished that government or the military gets in kind of secreting away evidence, the better it is for them in these later cases. They find ways to cover it up. They find skeptics and debunkers to make counter-arguments. But in the very early cases, it's still too new for them. And their mistakes in getting rid of the evidence and in covering it up are just glaring mistakes. And that's what Roswell, 1947 Roswell crash was. It was an effort to, at first, there was absolutely no cover-up. This is the astounding thing. The government came right out, the military came right out and said it was a flying saucer. So the very first thing they did was admit they captured a flying saucer. And believe it or not, that press release issued out of the 509th Walker Field in Roswell is really sufficient legal evidence that the government knew what it had and what it was talking about. Then the next day, of course, they came up with a cover story that it was a weather balloon, but that story was so manifestly untrue. Let's give it three basic reasons that it was untrue. I mean, untrue on its face, okay? The reason it was a weather balloon, they said, but it was an exotic kind of weather balloon, a radar target weather balloon. It was so advanced that even the base intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel, would not have recognized the material in that balloon, right? That was their first attempt to cover it up. Well, what were weather balloons made of in July 1947? They were made of neoprene rubber, the same kind of neoprene rubber that was used for the most part throughout World War II. So, of course, the base intelligence officer would have recognized something as common as neoprene rubber. That's one. Two, where were the weather balloons manufactured? Right across the street from the Roswell Army Airfield. Right? So even the people at the tech sergeant and staff sergeant level at the Roswell Army Air Force Base knew that there were weather balloons across the street. Would they have made that same mistake? Of course not. So that's two. Three, we actually, if it were a weather balloon, why would General Roger Ramey have demanded that the material from that crash be flown to Fort Worth for the purpose of identifying it as a weather balloon? I mean, so you've got three things the government itself did, right, that immediately overshadows the cover story. One, they admitted what it really was, a flying saucer. Then they came up with a bunch of cover stories and excuses, none of which worked. So even if we take those 2 days in July at their face value, the government story falls apart. But the government actually made the story worse. They then came out years later and said, oh, no, it was a Project Mogul balloon to test the amount of nuclear residue in the atmosphere from the Soviet Union nuclear tests, atomic bomb tests. So, of course, they wouldn't have recognized this at Roswell. This was like top secret. Well, again, I get it. I understand what they were doing, but go back to 1947 and ask yourself, what were the kinds of balloons the government used for high-altitude snooping, right, sniffing in 1947. They didn't have these large Project Mogul balloons until 1949, 1950, right? So, well, right, but I'm just telling you that was what they had. What they had in 1947 were the traditional World War II weather balloons tethered together to get to the high altitudes. So Project Mogul, circa July 1947, would have used standard weather balloons made of neoprene rubber, right? You would have needed a time machine to get Mylar balloons up in 1947 because they didn't use them in 1947. So that story falls apart. Then there was the crash dummies, right? Well, two questions. The crash dummies weren't used in these tests of balloon crashes until the 1950s. So again, you'd have to have a time machine to go back. And this is Stan Friedman's argument, not mine, but it makes sense. Stan Friedman has said you would need a time machine to go back to 1947 to use crash dummies because they weren't even used until the early 1950s. That's one. And two, why would you use crash dummies as little people, right? These kind of little people. What's the point of a crash dummy? It looks and is the same size as a kind of a standard, off-the-wall, 6 foot something, 5'9", 5'10" human being. Mm-hmm. Why would you do a crash dummy that doesn't look human? I don't get it, right? What are you trying to prove? So even the crash dummy argument again fails. So every single argument that the government has made for a cover-up has failed. Then you get to the latest cover story from last year. Oh, these were little children that were distorted medically, that were destroyed medically by Josef Mengele. Quite insulting. Dr. Mengele was the doctor at Auschwitz who performed inhumane. He tortured people in the concentration camp, tortured them, and to actually use that as an argument for why there were little figures at the Roswell crash is insulting, abusive. I can go on and on for the rest of the hour on this. So that's one. Then to say it was a Horton Brothers flying wing, and that's why it wasn't recognized. The United States had jet and rocket-assisted takeoff, auxiliary takeoff engines that were used in 1945, 1946. So you're telling me that in 1947, the intelligence officer wouldn't have recognized a jet engine? We were using them 2 years earlier. The Germans were using them as jet-powered Messerschmitts at the end of World War II. There weren't enough of them to do any damage. Had there been more, we would have been in serious trouble, but the Germans were using them. We knew about jet engines. We knew about jet engines all the way back in the 1930s when they were first experimented with. Rocket engines we knew about from the V-1 and from the V-2 because we were using V-2 missiles in 1947, and the Germans had used air-breathing engines on the V-1s that were bombing London. So tell me we didn't know about jet engines? That's what was powering the Horton Brothers flying wing. As for exotic materials, the Horton Brothers flying wing, which, by the way, we had in the 1930s, so we knew the shape, was made of wood. How exotic is that? So every single technological, physiological government reaction shows that none of the cover stories worked. I could go on and on about all the documentation from official government sources about Roswell, from the FBI, from Wright Field, from Nathan Twining, the head of the Air Materiel Command. I could go on and on about this. Every shred of evidence shows that whatever it was that crashed at Roswell was not a flying wing, was not a weather balloon, was not a Project Mogul balloon, and were not crash dummies. And in fact, in a deathbed statement, an affidavit sworn out in contemplation of death, which has a very high legal credibility in terms of evidence, former Lieutenant Walter Haut, who was a bombardier in the Army Air Force in World War II and was the public information officer at the Roswell Army Base, who released a statement to the newspapers, Army captures flying disc at Roswell. He swore an affidavit that was released in 2005, basically saying he was an eyewitness to the debris field, an eyewitness to the exotic material from the crash site, handled the exotic material from the crash site, had a piece of that exotic material on his desk, saw the alien bodies, saw the spacecraft, saw it on top of a flatbed as it was rolling under a tarp that was rolling out of the Roswell base, attended a meeting with 8th Army Air Force Commander Roger Ramey, who was actually at the Roswell Army Air Force Base the day before Jesse Marcel flew the material to Fort Worth, where the whole cover-up was put in place. So now, in addition to everything else, you have eyewitness testimony set forth in an affidavit made in contemplation of death as to what really happened at Roswell. How much more do you need?
You need that craft landing on the White House lawn.
Which it did just about 5 years later in 1952, captured on film, captured in still photographs when UFOs appeared over Washington, D.C. in July in 1952. And the head of Project Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt from the Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt, actually wrote in his book about UFOs are real, the UFO question. He coined the term UFOs, by the way. Edward Ruppelt actually described the interactions between these craft and our own Air Force jets. The fact that these craft were spotted on radar screens on the ground at Andrews Air Force Base, D.C. National Airport, Dulles Airport, on radar screens, on the pilots' radar screens, because remember, the United States Air Force had radar-directed guns in 1952. We were using them in the Korean War. So there was that, and he described how General Sanford of the Air Force managed the cover-up, calling it weather inversions, and marshaled together all the pilots who chased these UFOs, the radar operators, and got them to swear these were all malfunctions of their radar equipment, even though Edward Ruppelt says there were no malfunctions. So the head of Project Blue Book himself described the very thing you just asked about, UFOs over the White House.
The thing that I find fascinating about Roswell that you brought to my attention that I didn't know was that there was not really an awareness in the government prior to 1947 about UFOs.
Well, we knew there was something strange as early as 1945 because of the strange flyovers at the Hanford nuclear processing plant. So we knew something was up, which is why I believe the government moved so quickly to impose a cover-up, because the Hanford plant was top secret, absolutely over the top secret for two reasons. One, it was the plant wherein we were enriching uranium for the two bombs we would drop on Japan later that year at the end of that summer in August. That's first of all. And two, we were absolutely concerned about whether the Japanese would have the nuclear bomb, which they did, by the way, or the Germans were out of the war at that point. But still, there was a fear about that. So you've got a top-secret nuclear facility, and we are in war. We're a nation at war. So obviously, craft that could fly over that nuclear plant were, violating airspace in a top-secret facility. So, of course, the government knew something was up. Then when rescue pilot, private pilot, Kenneth Arnold in 1947 saw these strange craft over Mount Rainier, that's a double sighting over the state of Washington, confirmed. He thought they were United States secret aircraft being tested, but he didn't call it. He didn't say they were from outer space or anything. So that's two of these things. So that when Roswell happened the following month, in 1947, early July, obviously this time it got even more serious. So, in fact, it was so serious that the government, that in 1947, latter part of July, there was a class at the National Air War College of officers that were going to be promoted to senior officer, possibly general staff, policy-making rank. Our war colleges, Army, Navy, Air War, these are all the places where the most, the best of the best, the most promising younger officers, combat tested, field tested, who show great promise, these officers are then elevated to policy making, and this is really important for the military, policy making rank, usually general staff, okay? They become staff officers attached to various divisions. The National Air War College in 1947 to 1948, that one-year class, basically took these most promising officers from World War II. Where did that National Air War College go in in July 1948, April 1948, but before they graduated? After spending most of the year, they were sent to Wright Field. It was not yet Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where they were shown the debris from the crash at Roswell. They examined it, and they were shown the remains of the humanoid pilots of that craft that crashed, and they were shown the live humanoid alien, and we have the testimony, the deathbed testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder, Black Mac Magruder, a World War II hero, who his son wrote a book about him. It's out now from, forget the name of the press, I think it's Algonquin Press, down in New Orleans. He saw the live alien and told his children before he died that he saw the live alien. This is also, that story is in a UFO magazine issue, which folks can get if they just write to me, or they go online to www.ufomag.com. They can get that issue with the Marion Magruder story in it. The point is, so we actually have the Air War College sending these promising young officers to make policy about what happened at Roswell, and all the dissertations, all the master's theses that came out of that Air War class all dealt with the tactical use of nuclear weapons. Interesting. Why? And again, 4 years later, Marion Magruder was called to the Pentagon when the UFOs invaded Washington airspace in July 1950. He was picked up in a military staff car, black military staff car, driven to the Pentagon. He was in the Marines, driven to the Pentagon. He was there in the Pentagon listening to the radio transmissions between the pilots and ground air traffic controllers as they were vectored toward the UFOs. If this were the only piece of testimony, you can say, oh, well, it's not corroborated, but it's not the only piece of testimony. Edward Ruppelt corroborates Marion Magruder's testimony, and Al Chop, who was the Pentagon press officer at the time, corroborates both Ruppelt and Marion Magruder. Astounding. Just astounding. And that's so when you talk about the government being concerned about this, not only were they concerned about it, they were apoplectic about this.
But there are a lot of people that say that there aren't even UFOs and that everything that is put into that UFO category are just really government black op projects. Do you think there's any credence to that, or do you think there's a percent that might be black ops projects that are covered up with UFO stuff, or is...
Well, yes, I do, to answer your question. I think the overwhelming majority of UFO sightings that really can't be nailed down as like, oh, it's a flying this or a flying that. I think a lot of them are probably are probably top secret government aircraft, Air Force craft or Navy craft. And we know this because of what happened in the 1980s with the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber, the B-2 stealth bomber, the Spirit bomber. We know that when the Air Force was flying these craft over Nevada, over the Northwest, out over the Pacific Test Range, these craft, they were bat-wing aircraft. They are bat-wing aircraft. People said, oh, these are UFOs. And the government wasn't going to say, oh, no, these are the secret planes we're going to use in future. No, they said, fine, the UFOs, great. In fact, one CIA officer said to Aviation Week, the magazine Aviation Week and Space Technology, it's a good thing there are UFOs because if they didn't exist, we'd have to invent them. What a statement.
That is quite the statement. And
back in the 1960s, UFOs were the perfect cover for the U-2 and the developing SR-71 Blackbird spy plane. So, of course, a lot of these are unconventional craft. Talk about the UFOs that seem to be the triangles that seem to hover, that seem to float, that look as if they're partially invisible. No problem. We have cloaking technology now. You can build your own cloaking technology. There's one on YouTube. It's a Mercedes-Benz. That's an invisible Mercedes-Benz SUV. How do they do it? They put cameras on one side of the car. You go to Radio Shack, buy small cameras, tiny, tiny little surveillance cameras, or any spy shop. Make the whole side of your car, the hidden side, the side away from the viewer, cameras. On the side facing the viewer, put little micro televisions. Okay, so each camera is broadcasting the image from behind the car into the TV monitors on the cars facing viewers. If you did that and you turned the television cameras on and the monitors on, what would you see? You'd see the light images from the other side of the car broadcast through the television monitors. The car would look invisible. You could do this with today's technology from Radio Shack. You don't need a gazillion dollars to do this. The government has a gazillion dollars to do this. So think of how much more advanced that cloaking, not even stealth, but cloaking technology would be. And believe me, we've been experimenting with stealth technology ever since the 1940s, using electronic stealth technology to hide our warships. We have stealth technology since the 1970s, and we're developing the stealth fighter and bomber. We've been using stealth radar technology to take radar signals and move them from one place to another so our planes on radar seem invisible. And in fact, that's what UFOs have been doing ever since the 1950s with that RB-47 encounter over the southern United States when a reconnaissance B-47 bomber was tracked by a UFO that appeared and disappeared on radar, even the kind of radar that was like skin paint radar was disappearing. It was using a kind of stealth technology. We've been using that. And so if we were using that ever since World War II as a concept, and I've been using it straight through the 20th century, imagine how advanced we must be today in using that kind of cloaking technology. Invisible soldiers, invisible battleships, invisible aircraft. So, I think that, quite frankly, you combine invisibility cloaking devices with neutral buoyancy aircraft, with holographic projection onto cloud banks, and you've basically defined an extraterrestrial spacecraft. And I think 95% of all the things that are seen are those kind of craft.
Do you think some of that technology has been back engineered from the craft that have landed or have been found?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think that since World War II, the idea of stealth has been something we've been working on ever since 1943. So I don't think it took a UFO crash or a flying saucer crash to tell us that invisibility worked. I mean, just think, H.G. Wells, right? The Invisible Man. I mean, we've had invisibility as a concept. really ever since the 1940s. We've had flying wings. Look at this great movie written by H.G. Wells, based on his book, Things to Come, circa 1938, starring Raymond Massey. It was a movie about things to come. What were they flying? Flying wings. So what I'm trying to get to is that, in essence, unless we discover, and I don't know that we discover, some exotic propulsion system from a downed craft, i.e., using something like dark energy forces, harnessing dark energy, the energy that somehow keeps the universe expanding, that kind of thing. Unless we're able to see that, really what we're left with is a kind of a conventional technology for surveillance, for invisibility, for cloaking, for holographic projection. And I think that even if we saw these kinds of technologies in downed UFOs, that, yeah, we probably reverse engineer what we could reverse engineer, what we have the technology to reverse engineer. You know, if we don't have the industrial mechanism for reverse engineering something, it just sits there as kind of a holy grail. But I think we did do reverse engineering back in the 1950s and 1960s, and of things that were in our ken at the time: the transistor, the integrated circuit, fiber optics, maybe high tensile fabrics like Kevlar. I think those are the kinds of things we were able to do because we have the technology, the industrial technology, to fabricate these kinds of things. But in terms of advanced propulsion systems, maybe that's on the drawing boards now.
And I'm just kind of going off on a little tangent here. You know, you read the information about the ancient Vimanas, and it seemed like they were mind-controlled, you know, intention-controlled, and it just makes you wonder, well, maybe that's how these crafts actually work, and we don't really know how to interface with them. You know, that there's something that we just don't get.
Well, look at the kind of craft the Vimana were flying. They were these kind of flying obelisk kinds of crafts, really flying saucers, and that's how they're described in the Vedic texts. And they were powered, and this is what's so fascinating, talking about reverse engineering, they were powered by what the Vedic text called red mercury. Mercury is a very heavy metal, and they were in two counter-rotating cylinders. So if you rotate at high speed a heavy metal like mercury, right, what you will get is kind of a radiation field. If you have counter-rotating cylinders, you'll have a very high radiation field. If you rotate them at hyperspeeds, what will the radiation field do? Well, according to the Vedic text, that was the propulsion system for the craft that the Vimana were navigating. In the 1930s, Himmler, right, the Nazi General Himmler, right, his group, trying to find the true extraterrestrial source of the Aryan race. These people were insane occultists from the early 30s straight through World War II. Insane occultists, trying to find some occult substantiation for the superiority of the Aryans. Thank you, Madame Helena Blavatsky from the 19th century, but because she was she was the one proposing the mastery of the Aryan race in her theories of theosophy. Well, the Germans picked up on this in their philosophy, and they went all over the world to try to find evidence of the existence of prehistoric Aryans, and they came up with a theory that the Aryan race came to Earth, came to Thule, Greenland, from a planet called Aldebaran. Sound familiar? And they flew these craft that are captured in the Vedic texts, described in the Vedic text using counter-rotating cylinders of a substance called red mercury. So one of the people who was experimenting with this, he was a Nazi SS colonel, an electrical engineer called he was Kurt Davis, D-E-B-U-S. After the German rocket laboratory, the experimental facility, it was actually a concentration camp at Peenemünde, was bombed by the British to try and slow down. It's the same thing we're doing today. We're going to bomb the Iranians to slow down their nuclear processing facility. Well, the Allies bombed Peenemünde all the way back in 1942 to slow down the Germans' development with rockets. They learned from the United States and from Robert Goddard in New Mexico in the 1920s and 30s. So what the Germans did was they moved the rocket testing facility, the exotic testing facility, first to buried it inside a mountain, Mitteldauer, and then they had then they had this advanced testing facility in the Owl Mountains in Poland called Project Risa. Risa, by the way, in German means journey. And so they hollowed out this entire mountain, and in it they had this bell-shaped, this artillery shell-shaped object, according to an SS officer who testified at the end of World War II. He was captured in 1945 by the Soviets, using counter-rotating cylinders of very heavy metal, generating a radiation field, an electromagnetic and radiation field so intense that the scientists themselves were killed. The project manager was Kurt Davis. 20 years after that object simply disappeared from that cave, I mean not a trace, an artillery shell-shaped bell-like object does a long S-curve over the northeastern United States, over Michigan, Ohio, into Pennsylvania, crash lands outside of Pittsburgh in a little town called Kecksburg, and who was the director of NASA who had sent a retrieval team to that spot even before the object crashed? NASA director and Cape Canaveral launch director Kurt Davis, the very same person brought to the United States, war crimes expunged, given a whole new life, Kurt Davis from the SS. Amazing, isn't it?
Just amazing, yeah. But if NASA knew about it, kind of that it was coming down, that gives you the impression that it was in the United States, or, well, I guess he was in charge of NASA, so he already knew how to build it and how to make it, because he's the one that designed it.
Or was it the same craft that disappeared 20 years earlier? In other words, had the Germans, and they called this the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, okay, the weapon that would win World War II, even as the Russians closed in, the Soviets closed in on Poland. What if you had a device that actually could travel in time, not perfected, but that could travel in time in such a way that you could send saboteurs back to kill a Winston Churchill, to negotiate with a Franklin D. Roosevelt, to conduct negotiations with key senators to keep the U.S. out of World War II, to keep the Japanese from bombing Pearl Harbor? If you knew that the only reason the United States got into World War II was that Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, we knew in advance they were going to do. I mean, we'd broken the Japanese codes, so we knew they were coming. Eyewitnesses saw the Japanese fleet on its way. They were told to shut up and maintain radio silence, and so we knew it. It was our way to get into the war. We had to get into the war. So, but what if the Japanese had not attacked Pearl Harbor? What if they didn't? What if the U.S. never got into the war? What if the plan was the Japanese hold the Pacific, the Western Pacific Rim, right? The Germans maintain their grip on Europe, and the United States never gets into World War II. Do you realize the U.S. would have been completely isolated and ready to make a separate peace with the Axis powers? The Japanese keep Indochina. They stay in China. Let the Soviets and the Nazis fight it out. And the United States, surrounded on both oceans by an enemy, really has no choice but to capitulate and make a separate peace. Wouldn't that have been something the Germans would have wanted? We know they wanted a separate peace because Rudolf Hess took a glider flight into England very early in the war to negotiate with the British on staying out of the war. So we know that part of the German plan was to invade Europe and then negotiate peace with the Allies to keep the British and the Americans out. So imagine if a time machine could have gotten back before Pearl Harbor to keep the United States out of the war. I mean, think of the exotic strategies. The Germans had jet engines. The Germans had a plane that could be launched, go into the upper atmosphere, right almost in low Earth orbit, and then dive down on American B-17 bombers bombing Germany, take out the fighters, take out the bombers. It was never really fully deployed. The Japanese knew about nuclear reactions at the outset of World War II, but they felt that the technology was so exotic and they were so confident of the air superiority of the Zero, the Japanese main warplane, and it was a superior plane to our early fighters, that they were confident that they could win the war quickly. We were confident because we kept the Japanese from capturing the Indo-Chinese oil fields and the Burmese oil fields even before World War II started, just like we kept the Germans out of the Middle Eastern oil fields, right? Field Marshal Montgomery defeating General Rommel to keep him out of the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, even before we entered the war in North Africa. So we defeated the Axis powers and prevented them from getting their hands on oil. So we were in a position to fight that war and to take the hit at Pearl Harbor. So my point being that if that could have been reversed in some way, shape, or form, then the outcome of the war would have been very different. And given the exotic weapons the Germans had and why they counterattacked in Belgium at the Battle of the Bulge to prevent the Allied forces from breaking through and reaching the Rhine, to give themselves time to deploy some of these weapons, like the V-2, like the V-1, to start bombing the U.S. with V-2 missiles launched from submarines or V-1s launched from submarines. I mean, my God, the war would have been different. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you look at how the Germans developed exotic weaponry and what was never really deployed, had the war gone on longer, it would have been a very different outcome.
Do you think the Germans had access to alien technology?
Well, the Germans themselves said they did. I mean, Hermann Oberth, who was one of the scientists that came over in Operation Paperclip, wound up in Washington at NASA, but also in Washington as part of the brain trust of Army R&D. Hermann Oberth actually made the public statement, "We were helped by people from other worlds."
That's pretty straightforward.
That's pretty straightforward. And, of course, Werner von Braun was in New Mexico when the Roswell crash happened. So he was one of the people consulting on that. Yeah, I think they were. In fact, we know they were. We know they had seen extraterrestrial events taking place because in NASA's own history of, it's called lunar anomalies, and I forget the name of the actual NASA report. You can find it online. Just, go to Google, type in NASA report on lunar anomalies, and up it will come. It's 500 years of lunar anomalies. In that report, there are citations to German astronomers who were witnessing artificial structures on the moon. So the Germans themselves saw artificial structures on the moon. So the Germans, the British, even colonial Americans.
And this is like years and years ago. We're not talking about people, doing, Google Space or taking, the 60s moon mission pictures and looking for stuff. This is much older material.
Germans looking through telescopes in the 1920s and 30s.
Wow. That's something to check out. Making a little mental note here. Well, maybe you could talk about that. I'm looking at the clock. We have 10 minutes, so why don't you just kind of talk a little bit more about what they've noticed on the moon? I mean, do they think they're active bases? Do they think they are ancient?
Well, I mean, clearly, if Cotton Mather, who was this New England colonial, fire and brimstone preacher, Cotton Mather was very famous in American literature, is very famous in American literature because of his sermons, these fire and brimstone predetermination sermons about what's awaiting the unsaved in hell. I mean, this really was. Remember, New England America, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the Pilgrims themselves. When people say they fled religious persecution in England, they were zealot Protestants. They were reformers. They saw that the Anglican Church, right, the Church of England, was really the Catholic Church, but instead of having the Pope as the supreme head of the Church, the monarch of England was the head of the Church, right? It all goes back to Henry VIII wanting to marry Anne Boleyn, right? So we're not doing a history lesson, but that was how the Church of England came into being. Well, this was all happening at the same time that across Europe was this religious zealotry. Religious zealotry that said that the Church, the Catholic Church, as it then existed, and to some extent today, was built on idolatry. You worship the figures of saints. You worship saints' relics. You worship, the whole business of that in the Catholic Mass, the wafer and the goblet of wine actually physically transmutate into the body and blood of Christ. And the Protestants said, you know what? This is idolatry. This is like paganism. Even if we agree that the Holy Mass, right, is but we say it's symbolic. It doesn't transmute. It simply represents. It's emblematic. It represents the body. These are the kinds of basic dogma differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, and they began to deviate. Well, the Pilgrims faced persecution in England because they wanted to cleanse the church of all the idolatry. They believed that the Archbishop of Canterbury was not the supreme head of the church. They believed there was a priesthood of all believers, that if you simply believed and followed the rules set forth in the Old and New Testament, that was all you needed, that in many cases the elect, those who had been chosen to be saved, that was all predetermined. So Cotton Mather was the preacher who headed up the head of the ministry in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in addition to being the kind of person that he was, fire and brimstone and the dangers of hell, the torments of hell, he was also a pretty rational guy. And he saw lights, call them UFOs if you want to, but lights floating over the lunar surface all the way back in the middle 17th century. So that's our first, in America, that's our first lunar anomaly sighting. And since then, people have seen structures on the moon, bridges, artificial factories. People who worked at NASA said they saw craft on the lunar surface that were not ours. At least one person who is a psychologist today, even in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, said that when he was in the Air Force, and this is an article in UFO Magazine too, he saw a factory-like structure on the moon. In other words, either this was our structure in secret lunar landings, this is circa 1962-63, either lunar landings we'd done in the 60s or factory facilities put up by extraterrestrials. In the scrubbed NASA radio transmissions back and forth from the moon, there are stories of roads, highways on the moon, or astronauts are being shot at on the moon. They had discovered one astronaut said, somebody's been here before us. They were surveilled on the moon. Then you ask yourself, if we spent all this money to get to the moon, and talk about, this is current, by the way, So all this money to get to the moon. Newt Gingrich, in his campaign, is talking about a lunar base by the end of his second term in office. So let's just say it's now 2020, right? He's been president now since 2013, runs again and wins in 2016. It's now 2020, 2021. Now, he's saying there will be a lunar base, an American military base on the surface of the moon. And that's brilliant. That's visionary. Hey, guess what? Go read my book, Day After Roswell. In that book, in the appendix, is an official Army plan called Project Horizon, set forth in the middle 1950s for establishing an American Army base with a whole new Army command called Lunar Command on the surface of the moon. What's its purpose? It's a fortress on which to look down on the Soviets and keep the moon as high ground from the Soviets or the Chinese establishing a high ground on the moon, and also to be a moon base for intercepting flying saucers coming into the Earth's atmosphere. Come on. I mean, this has been around for 60 years, and
he's just pulling it out and dusting it off.
Yeah, what I'm saying is this just shows you how long we've been dealing with this material.
Well, but what's interesting is if there has been this obviously long-standing knowledge that there were some kind of activity going on the moon, then why go up there and then just totally cover it up?
Well, that's the whole point. Why go up there and then stop going up there? I mean, the whole plan was to mine the surface of the moon. There are incredible exotic materials up there. You know, you establish a base, you establish an orbiting lunar station, you establish a physical base on the lunar surface, you begin mining operations, you're sending shuttles back and forth to the lunar surface, you're sending a lot of these exotic elements back to Earth. I mean, that was the original plan. Mine it, establish it, fortify it, use it as a surveillance point, and basically, and now think of this, we can assemble spacecraft in space. That's part of the Mars mission, right? So why not use the moon to assemble the spacecraft and assemble them in lunar orbit, then use the lunar orbit for the slingshot effect of getting out past Earth, or using the lunar orbit to Earth, slingshotting around Earth and going to the outer planets. We had this underway in 1969, in 1970, yet we stopped going to the moon. Why did we stop going to the moon? Was it like bad TV? I mean, you know, we weren't getting the ratings anymore from these lunar landings, and so we stopped. That's insane. All the money we invested for nothing, unless we invested it for something. And we did establish bases on the moon, on the dark side of the moon. This is called the secret lunar landing, the secret space program. We did establish bases on the dark side of the moon. We've worked with extraterrestrials or other countries on the dark side of the moon, and we have a fully established base on the dark side of the moon.
Yeah, it's a lot for you to take all in, but when I think of conspiracy theories in the general sense of the word, it's like there are so many right now that it's almost like if you have one smoking gun, this whole giant house of cards is just going to fall over and expose so much stuff.
Correct.
It's just amazing. Very, very quickly, because we're going to go to break. What about Mars? You know, they've sent up the probes and stuff, and we've had a couple of successful landings, and when they've had those ones that have not landed successfully, the first thing that was in my mind, and this was before I even knew about the bases on the moon or anything like that, I thought, there's somebody up there and they're shooting them down.
Well, yeah, that's one conspiracy thought for sure. I don't think they'd shoot us down. I think that what they would probably do is...
Well, they don't want us there. You know, they don't want us
there. They can
there.
interfere with our electronics, so we think we're landing, but we're really not. You know, there are a whole bunch of things we have that technology. I mean, so we don't need advanced Martian culture to basically do to us what we can already do. I mean, all you've got to do is look at just for example, we've got stealth technology. We were using that stealth technology to bomb Serbia back during the Clinton administration. We used it in Gulf War I. We certainly, the Israelis used it when they took out the Syrian nuclear reactor years ago. They basically, and even the Iranians used it. The Iranians were able to spoof GPS, which is what our drone that was in Afghanistan was looking at to do its course. They spoofed the GPS. So they actually fed that. They were able to capture the telemetry signal to that drone, commandeer the drone, take over from our commandeering, commandeer the drone to fly over the Iranian border and land. If the Iranians have that technology, wouldn't you think the Martians would have that technology?
Yeah. Bill, there's the music, which means we need to go to break. So I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking with Bill Birnes, his new book, the Everything UFO book, his webpage, UFOmag.com, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.